November 4, 1942. The western edge of Egypt. Late afternoon light bleeds across the desert as engines fall silent. At the headquarters of Panzer Army Africa, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel studies a map that no longer reflects reality. The lines are still drawn, the arrows are still bold, but the lifeblood that makes those arrows move, fuel, ammunition, food, is gone. Outside, German and Italian tanks sit half-buried in sand, their crews waiting beside them, powerless. Many have fuel for less than a day, some have none at all. Artillery batteries ration shells as if they were gold. Infantry units receive bread measured in ounces. There is no reserve. There will be no resupply. Rommel understands before his staff finishes speaking. The Mediterranean has closed. Across the sea, Allied aircraft and warships have turned the Axis supply routes into killing grounds. Convoy after convoy has been intercepted, burned, or sunk. Tankers explode before reaching Africa. Ammunition ships vanish beneath the waves. Spare parts never arrive. What survives the sea is destroyed from the air before it reaches the front. This is not a battlefield defeat, no decisive encirclement, no collapse under enemy fire. It is quieter than that. Rommel listens, nods once, and delivers a judgment that cuts deeper than any casualty report. The army, he says, can no longer be supplied, and without supply, it can no longer fight. The Desert Fox, celebrated across Europe for audacity, speed, and tactical genius, has reached a conclusion no maneuver can undo. His tanks may still point west, his soldiers may still stand in formation, but the campaign is already over. Not because the enemy has outmaneuvered him, because the sea has decided the war.
When he arrived in North Africa in February 1941, Erwin Rommel inherited a mission born of political urgency rather than strategic logic. Adolf Hitler did not intend to conquer Egypt. He intended to rescue an ally. Italy's armies had collapsed in Libya, and Germany sent a small expeditionary force to stabilize the front. Nothing more. Rommel ignored the limitation immediately. Aggressive by instinct and impatient with defensive war, he drove east with speed that shocked both enemies and superiors. His early victories transformed a minor intervention into a continental spectacle. British forces were flung back across Cyrenaica. Tobruk was surrounded. Newspapers crowned him the Desert Fox, a commander who seemed to bend distance and terrain to his will. But every mile east carried a cost invisible to headlines. North Africa was not Europe. There were no rail networks feeding the front. Everything, fuel, shells, rations, replacement engines, had to cross the Mediterranean, unload in Tripoli or Benghazi, and then move hundreds of miles over desert roads that devoured vehicles and men alike. Rommel knew this. He wrote about it repeatedly. His letters and reports returned to the same complaint with growing urgency. Supplies were insufficient, ports were too small, distances too vast. He requested more shipping, more escorts, more fuel. He received encouragement instead. Berlin wanted victories. Rome promised deliveries it could not protect. Meanwhile, the balance at sea shifted. By 1942, Allied naval intelligence had cracked Axis communications. Submarines prowled shipping lanes with increasing confidence. Malta, battered but unbroken, served as a dagger aimed at the convoy routes. Allied bombers turned harbors into burning traps. Ships that left Italy rarely arrived intact. Loss rates climbed into the catastrophic. In some months, over half of all Axis supplies bound for Africa were destroyed before unloading. Fuel, the single most critical resource for armored warfare, was hit hardest. Tanks without fuel became immobile steel coffins.
Rommel continued to fight anyway. At Gazala, at Tobruk, at the gates of Egypt, he gambled on speed to outrun logistics. Each offensive assumed that success itself would solve the supply problem, that captured depots would sustain the next push. It was a logic of desperation masked as audacity. But by autumn 1942, the illusion was gone. The British Eighth Army, reorganized and reinforced, stood at El Alamein with overwhelming material superiority. Behind them lay short, secure supply lines. Behind Rommel lay exhaustion, overstretch, and an empty sea. When the Allied offensive began, Rommel was not defeated by surprise or incompetence. He was defeated by arithmetic. His army consumed more fuel in a day than the Mediterranean could deliver in a week. And now, as reports arrived confirming that the convoys had failed again, ships sunk, cargoes lost, ports bombed, Rommel saw the truth in full. The North African campaign had not reached its climax. It had already passed. As October turned to November, the war around Rommel accelerated while his options collapsed. British artillery at El Alamein fired shells by the tens of thousands. Entire minefields were cleared overnight and relayed by morning. Replacement tanks arrived faster than losses could be counted. The desert, once Rommel's ally, now favored the side with fuel depots instead of audacity. Inside Panzer Army Africa, the mood hardened into grim clarity. Fuel allocations were reduced again. Units received movement orders measured in kilometers, not objectives. A tank battalion might be authorized a single maneuver before being forced to halt. Engines were run only at night to conserve what little remained. Disabled vehicles were stripped where they stood, cannibalized for parts that might keep others alive one more day.
Rommel issued orders that betrayed his understanding of what was coming. Retreats were planned in advance. Rear guards were designated not to win battles, but to buy hours. Ammunition dumps were dispersed, not expanded, because there would be no replenishment. Communications with Berlin grew sharper in tone. Rommel warned that without immediate, massive supply deliveries, the army would disintegrate under pressure. He did not speak in metaphors, he spoke in numbers, liters of fuel, tons of ammunition, the precise number of trucks still operational. The responses he received were abstract and delayed. Promises were made that convoys were sailing, that relief was coming, that faith must be maintained. Then the reports arrived. Convoys destroyed, escorts sunk, survivors turning back. Rommel's staff recorded his reaction not as rage, but as resignation. He had long understood the strategic imbalance, but now it was undeniable. The army was consuming itself faster than it could be fed. Each retreat burned irreplaceable fuel. Each counterattack consumed shells that could not be replaced. The enemy did not need to encircle him. Time and distance were doing that already. Rommel spoke to his officers with unusual directness. The situation, he said, was no longer a matter of tactics. Courage would not solve it. Skill would not reverse it. Even victory in the next engagement would change nothing. Without supply, there could be no sustained defense, let alone another offensive. What he articulated, often paraphrased by those present, was a truth rarely spoken so plainly by a field commander in the middle of a campaign. Wars, he said, are decided by supply lines, not by bravery, not by genius, by the quiet, relentless movement of fuel and food. The statement carried weight precisely because of who said it.
This was Rommel, the general whose reputation rested on motion, surprise, and relentless pressure. The man who had repeatedly defied expectations by attacking when logic advised retreat. For him to acknowledge limits was to admit that the war itself had imposed a final boundary. As Allied forces pressed westward, Rommel ordered withdrawals that felt like surrender to officers trained for advance. Positions were abandoned not because they were indefensible, but because holding them would burn fuel better used to save the army itself. Italian units, already strained, began to fracture under the pressure. German formations absorbed their remnants, stretching resources even thinner. The desert was filled with the wreckage of an army retreating not from defeat, but from starvation. Every decision now carried a cost that could not be repaid. Rommel understood that the next choice, whether to continue resisting or to preserve what remained, would define not just the campaign, but his legacy. The decisive moment did not arrive with an explosion or a charge. It arrived as an order never sent. In early November 1942, Rommel faced the choice he had delayed for weeks. Hitler demanded that the line be held, not delayed, not traded for space, held. The Führer's directive was absolute. There would be no retreat from Africa. To withdraw was to concede weakness. To yield ground was to invite political disaster. Rommel read the order and understood its cost immediately. To obey meant annihilation. The army no longer possessed the fuel to maneuver, the ammunition to repel sustained assault, or the food to keep men functional. Holding a position would not halt the British advance. It would merely ensure that Panzer Army Africa would be crushed in place, its vehicles abandoned, its soldiers captured or killed without the dignity of movement. Rommel chose disobedience. Quietly, deliberately, and without theatrics, he ordered a retreat westward. Not a rout, a controlled withdrawal designed to preserve the core of the army. It was an act of military realism in direct conflict with political fantasy.
The emotional cost was severe. Rommel had built his reputation on audacity and obedience in results. Now he was openly defying the authority that had elevated him. He understood what it meant. Careers had ended for less. Lives had ended for less. But the alternative was unacceptable. He would not sacrifice an army to preserve an illusion. The retreat began under constant pressure. British forces pursued relentlessly, confident and well supplied. Each mile west consumed fuel that could not be replaced. Each defensive stand bought time measured in hours, not days. Rommel's officers watched their commander age visibly in weeks. Sleep vanished. Meals were skipped. Decisions were made with brutal efficiency. When fuel ran out, vehicles were destroyed. When ammunition dwindled, positions were abandoned. Nothing was sentimental. Everything was final. There were moments, recorded later by survivors, when Rommel spoke with stark honesty. The campaign, he said, had been lost long before El Alamein. It was lost the moment the Mediterranean became an Allied weapon. Lost when supply became a gamble instead of a certainty. Lost when logistics were treated as a secondary concern, rather than the foundation of war. No battlefield brilliance could undo that. The retreat continued across Libya, through towns once captured in triumph and now passed in silence. The army still fought, still resisted, but it did so knowing the end was no longer in doubt, only its timing. This decision could not be undone. Rommel had chosen to save men over territory, reality over rhetoric. In doing so, he severed himself from the myth that had surrounded him since 1941. He was no longer the unstoppable desert fox. He was a commander confronting the limits of power. And limits, once reached, do not negotiate. The consequences unfolded with cold inevitability. Panzer Army Africa continued its retreat into Tunisia, bleeding strength at every stop. By the time the remnants reached defensible ground, the army that had once threatened Egypt was a shadow of itself. Tanks were counted in dozens instead of hundreds. Fuel was guarded more closely than ammunition. Entire divisions existed only on paper. Rommel did not remain long enough to see the final collapse. In March 1943, he was recalled to Germany, officially for health reasons. Unofficially, his presence had become inconvenient. He had spoken too openly about failure. He had disobeyed orders and survived. The North African War would end without him, with the surrender of more than 250,000 Axis troops, one of the largest mass capitulations in German history. But the meaning of the moment he recognized in November 1942 endured far beyond the desert. Rommel's acknowledgement that the campaign was lost not by tactics but by logistics cut against the mythology of warfare that dominated the era. It challenged the idea that genius alone could overcome material reality. It exposed the fatal weakness of an empire that expanded faster than it could sustain. The Allies learned the opposite lesson. They had not defeated Rommel by brilliance alone. They had defeated him by securing ports, protecting convoys, dominating airspace, and ensuring that when their soldiers moved, fuel followed. The war in North Africa became a case study taught not for its battles, but for its supply chains. For Rommel, the recognition marked the end of an illusion. He had believed, briefly, that speed could replace supply, that momentum could substitute for infrastructure. North Africa proved otherwise. No commander, however skilled, could outrun the mathematics of war. What happened in the desert was not merely a campaign lost. It was the moment modern warfare revealed its true master. Not generals, not tanks, not courage, logistics. And once that truth was understood, it could never be forgotten.